Greetings from Serbia. My name is Nemanja Jurišić, and today on NT Podkast, the leading channel in the Balkans in the field of science and theology, we are honored to have a distinguished guest, philosopher, Dr. Andrew Loke. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure to have you on our show. For maybe those who don't know you, could you start by telling us a bit more about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a Singaporean currently working in Hong Kong. My first degree was in medicine. So after working as a doctor for several years, I decided that philosophy and religion is more important. So I went on to study philosophy and theology. I did my PhD at King's College London. And since then, I've written a number of books in the field of science and religion, and a number of books on the Kalam cosmological arguments, which we'll be talking about today. And because of my publications and my academic achievements, I've been elected as a fellow of the International Society for Science and Religion, which is one of the top academic societies that does research in the interdisciplinary field of science and religion. Yeah, so I'm also and currently an associate professor at Hong Kong Baptist University, which is a public university, and I teach courses on science and religion, and philosophy of religion, Christian studies. Yeah, so these are the things I do.
Amazing. Thank you very much. And yeah, you mentioned that in this episode, we will dive deep into the Kalam cosmological argument,
Yes.
exploring its implications and challenges. Yeah,
Mhm.
so at the very beginning, could you present your current and best version of the Kalam cosmological argument?
All right. So let me share my screen. Can you see it?
Yeah, I see it.
Okay. So the following slides are taken from a debate that I did with Daniel Linford uh, a few months ago at Capturing Christianity. And Daniel Linford is one of the world leading critics of the Kalam cosmological argument, right? So Linford, Joe Schmidt, and Graham Opie. So Linford and Schmidt, they wrote a book together. And Graham Opie, I had debated him a few years ago on Capturing Christianity as well. So the cosmological argument which I'm presenting today is an argument which I have defended against some of the world leading atheist critics. And it's an argument which I think can withstand their criticisms. And that's why I think it's the best version, right? And this version actually is a synthesis of different versions. It's basically the Kalam version, but I also bring in insights from the Leibnizian version and also the Thomistic tradition. Okay, so the argument goes like this. Okay, firstly, there are a now firstly there exists a series of cause and effects which we observe, right? So, for example, I came from my parents came from their grandparents, okay, and my grandparents came from their grandparents, right, great grandparents, for example. So there is a series of cause and effects, right? So I was brought into existence by my parents was brought into existence by their grandparents. And so the question here is whether there could be an infinite regress or not. And the cosmological argument tries to show that there isn't an infinite regress. And moreover, it is not the case that it's a closed loop, right? So no, either the series is an infinite regress or is not, or is finite, right? If it's finite, then either the members are the joined together like a loop that avoid a first cause, or it's not joined together. Now, if it's not joined together, then there must be a first cause, right? So these are the steps, right? That shows that these are the only possibilities, and then the argument rules out an infinite regress and rules out a closed loop and demonstrate that there must be a first cause. And then the next few steps tries to show that tries to answer the question, what is the first cause? Okay. So since the first cause is the first, it must be uncaused. And since the first cause, now since whatever begin to exist has a cause, right? This is the causal principle, which we will talk about later on. Now, since whatever begin to exist has a cause, the first cause must be without beginning. And since a change is an event which has a beginning, because what a change is that a change is something that gain or lose a property, right? That is the meaning of change. But then the first cause is without beginning. So what that means is that the first cause is not a change or event, rather is initially changeless. And when I use the word initial, what I mean here is that is referring to the first in the series of states that is ordered causally. So I'm not talking about a temporal. I'm not saying necessarily referring to an initial as in a temporal series, but it's a series of states, right? So the first cause, the initial state of the first cause is that it is without change initially. That is what it means. So it is a first cause that is without beginning and initially without change. And in order for such a first cause to bring about the first effect or the first event, whether is it the Big Bang or whatever, it could be something else other than the Big Bang, right? For all we know. Now, the first cause must have two capacities, right? First of all, it must have the capacity to bring about the event in such a way that it is undetermined by prior event, since the first cause is the first. And moreover, the first cause must have the capacity to prevent itself from changing, for otherwise it will not have been initially changeless, okay, and exist without an existing beginninglessly without the first change. So the first cause must have these two capacities. It must be able to prevent itself from changing such that it can exist initially without change, and yet also be able to bring about the first change by itself, right? So these two capacities describe what philosophers call libertarian freedom. It must be able to freely bring about the first event by itself. And therefore, the first cause must be something that has libertarian freedom. And whatever has libertarian freedom is a person, right? So it will have to be a free agent, a personal agent with free will, right, in order to bring about the first event. And so what this implies is that the first cause is a personal creator. And therefore, we have arrived at the conclusion that all the series of change and cause and effects which we observe must ultimately came from a first cause, which is a personal creator. And therefore, this shows that, that there must be a creator God, right? This first cause creator is what we mean by a creator God, and therefore a creator God exists. Yeah, so that's a summary of the cosmological argument, which shows that there is a creator God.
All right, thank you so much, and I really love your version of Kalam argument. And why do you consider it unlikely that we have a circular loop, for example, where point A causes point B, B causes C, C causes A again, and so on? So why don't you think this is the case with our universe?
Yeah, so there are a number of arguments which can be given to show that it is not a closed loop. And one of the arguments is the argument against the viciousness of a dependence regress, which is also an argument against the infinite regress as well, right? So I like to use this analogy, right, to talk about these arguments. Okay, so suppose we can talk about. So let me share my slide again. Okay, so suppose there is a series of train cars, and suppose that these train cars were not moving originally, and suppose that in order for the last train car to begin to move, it has to depend on the one before it to begin to move first, right? Before it can begin to move. But the problem is that in order for the one before it to begin to move, it has to depend on the one that is before it to begin to move first, before it can begin to move. Now, suppose that is the case, then it is very obvious that none of them would ever begin to move because everyone is dependent on the one before it, right? So what is needed is that there must be a first puller, right? There must be something that is relatively independent, right? There must be something that doesn't suffer from the same problem, right? That can have the ability to move by itself, right? Having an engine, right, that can start movement and don't need to depend on something else to pull it, but it has this capacity to, the engine, right, to start movement. So such a thing needs to exist, right, in order that the other, the train cars can begin to move. Okay, so what this analogy is trying to show is that, likewise, before I begin to exist, my parents had to begin to exist first, right? Because my existence depends on my parents. And before they begin to exist, their parents have to begin to exist first, right? Because they are dependent, right? Now, the problem is that no matter how many prior dependent causes there are, none of them would begin to exist because no prior dependent cause escapes from the problem of depending on a prior dependent member in order to begin to exist. So there is a vicious regress here. So likewise, what is required is that there must be a first cause which exists independently or necessarily, right? So such a first cause must exist. Just as in the case of the train cars, right? There must be a first puller, there must be a first engine. Such a thing need to exist, right? And you cannot escape from this problem by saying that it's a closed loop, right? It's a circle that you cannot. Just now you were saying that could it be that A depend on B, A came from B, B came from C, C came from A, right? That would be like saying that train car A is put by train car B and is put by train car C and is put by train car A. Of course, that doesn't work as well, right? Because every train cars will be dependent on each and on the other one, and you cannot have the train cars begin to move, right, by having such a closed loop. You will still need to have a first engine, right? A first cause that is relatively independent, right? So likewise, you cannot solve the problem by saying it's a loop, right? You cannot say that, okay, I came from my parents came from my grandparents, and my grandparents came from me, right? Again, that would not work as well, right? Because everyone will be dependent on the other one, right? So again, you'll be viciously circular, right? So yeah, so it will be like suffering from the chicken or the egg problem, right? Is it the chicken first or egg first? Right? So you cannot solve the problem that way. So rather, you need to have a first cause that is independent, and that will be the solution, right, to this problem. And so so there cannot be infinite regress and there cannot be a circular loop, but in any case, there must still be a first cause.
Okay, thank you so much. I noticed you mentioned Graham Oppy. He's an atheist, and he also agrees with you that this is not likely. So yeah, and another objection is about infinite regress. Yeah. So what are your arguments against dependence regress and against traversing an actual infinite?
Yeah, so I have already presented my argument against a dependence regress, right? So I already explained that just now. Using the analogy of the train car, right? That is the argument, right? Against infinite regress. So that argument alone is already enough to show that there must be a first cause. And there are a number of other arguments that philosophers have discussed, right? Such as the Hilbert Hotel argument, or the Green River paradox, or the traversing actual infinite argument against traversing actual infinite. So all these other arguments actually are not necessary, right? Because any one of these arguments will be enough to show that there cannot be infinite regress, right? The argument from dependence regress itself is already enough, right, to show that there cannot be infinite regress, and also to rule out a circular loop and to show that there must be a first cause. So this argument is already enough. But if you have time, we can talk about maybe just one other argument. So the argument against traversing an actual infinite. Now that argument is another way to show that there cannot be infinite regress. Okay, and basically what the argument is trying to show is that when we think about a series that is formed by successive addition, right? Say for example, so just now I mentioned that I came from my parents, my parents came from my grandparents. So we find that it's one generation following by another generation, and so this series of generations is formed by addition of one following by addition of one, right? So now the problem is that addition of one is addition of finite, right? And addition of another one is addition of another finite. Now, addition of finite plus addition of finite equals addition of finite, right? Because finite plus finite equals finite. Okay. So addition of finite plus an addition of finite, they will only form a finite series. So it is impossible to form an infinite series, right, from this process of addition addition of finite plus finite equals plus finite, right? So you cannot form an infinite series, right, from this process. And so what this shows is that this series must be a finite series. Now the problem is that if if there was an infinite regress, then that would entail the possibility that you can form an infinite series, right? From this process of plus finite. But as I already argued earlier on, right, plus finite can only give you finite. So we end up with a contradiction, right? So if there's an infinite regress, right, we end up with a contradiction. And so this shows that infinite regress cannot exist. Yeah.
Great. Why do you believe that the universe is not eternal? This would also be consistent with the first law of thermodynamics, whereas if God created the universe, we would have a contradiction with this law. What is your response on this objection?
Well, I would say that yeah, the universe cannot be simply eternal because, as I explained just now, using the cosmological argument, the argument shows that there cannot be an infinite regress of events of change, and therefore there must be a first change, and this first change must be caused by a first cause. And this first cause cannot be an infinite regress of change, right? The first cause must be initially changeless. And so this first cause will have to be that thing which is eternal, that thing that has no beginning. And this thing, and this first cause is not the universe, right? But this cause, first cause, as I said, right, is a personal creator. And therefore, the universe itself cannot be the first cause, right? The universe itself consists of a series of change. That is why, because the universe, by definition, is referring to something physical, right? The physical universe, right? The physical universe and physical things exist in a series of changes, right? As a series of events that, say, for example, can be described by quantum physics, right? So quantum physics indicates that there is constant fluctuations, which are changes. And moreover, the law of thermodynamics, right, is also talking about a dynamic system, right, which means that it's also a system that is constantly changing, right? So that is what we mean by a physical universe. Now, such a thing cannot be the first cause. Right? It cannot be without beginning. Why? Because, as I said, there cannot be an infinite regress of change, right? And so that there must be a first cause that is initially changeless, and that would also need to be the thing that is without beginning. And so the first cause is, and so the universe itself cannot be that thing that is without beginning, right? Because, as I said, there cannot be infinite regress. Now, so even if the universe, even if an eternal universe is consistent with the first law of thermodynamics, it doesn't mean that it can exist. Why? Because it violates the argument, right? It's contradicted by the argument against the infinite regress. Okay. And so that argument itself would show that the universe cannot be eternal. Now, what about God creating the universe? Does it contradict the first law of thermodynamics? No, it actually doesn't. Why? Because if the universe has a beginning, it could be that the total energy of the universe is still zero. So this is what some cosmologists have talked about when they talk about the zero energy universe theory. Now you can check out that. Some atheists have talked about that too, like Sean Carroll, for example. So Sean Carroll is a very famous atheist scientist, and he has said that if the Big Bang began without any material cause, that doesn't contradict the first law of thermodynamics. Why? Because the total energy of the universe could still be zero. Okay. So what the total energy means is that the positive energy and the negative energy, right? The positive and negative, if you take into account both of them, you can end up with zero energy. Okay, so the total energy of the universe could be zero, and so if the universe began from the Big Bang without any material cause, it doesn't actually violate the first law of thermodynamics, because the total energy is still zero, right? Now that, however, doesn't mean that's the first cause. It doesn't mean that therefore the universe could have begun without any cause whatsoever. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that the universe. It only means that the universe can begin to exist without any material cause, right? Without but it doesn't mean that it can begin without any efficient cause. Okay, So there must still be an efficient cause that brought about the universe in the way it is, right? Because as I mentioned just now, that there is a causal principle which says that whatever began to exist has a cause. Now the cause doesn't have to be material cause; it can be efficient cause, right? And there must still be an efficient cause. Why? Because you cannot have events. Because if something begins without any cause whatsoever, without material cause, without efficient cause, then we will expect to see other kinds of things begin to exist uncaused as well, right? And so we would expect to see tigers or lions suddenly pop into existence uncaused around us, but of course that's not the case, right? So I have a modus tollens arguments which I presented in my debate with Graham O.P. and Daniel Linford, which demonstrate that that's the case. And that modus tollens argument would show that whatever begin to exist would have to have a cause. Even if it's not a material cause, there must still be an efficient cause. And therefore, if the Big Bang began without any material cause, there must still be an efficient cause that makes it the way it is, right? That makes it such that that the universe exists in a state where the total energy is in the balance, right? The positive energy and negative energy, they cancel each other in the balance in that kind of way. Okay, there must still be a efficient cause to explain the reason why the universe exists in that way. Okay, and so this event would still require a cause, and it doesn't violate the first it doesn't violate the first law of thermodynamics because the total energy is still zero. Okay, so that would be one response, right, to this objection. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And let me ask you just quickly if I correctly understood. First law of thermodynamics just say that matter and energy is not created but by itself or some another matter, but rather from something transcendent. Am I correct?
Well, the first law of thermodynamics basically says that the total amount of energy matter, right, is constant, right? Yeah. So it's the law of conservation, right, of energy matter, right? So it says that it is constant. Yeah. So sometimes people get carried away by the phrase cannot be created or destroyed, right? But the more fundamental issue is that it's the conservation that it's talking about, right? And as I said just now, on the zero energy universe theory that Sean Carroll talked about, it is conserved, right? There's no violation of the conservation, right? Because the total energy is still zero, right? So positive energy, negative energy, they cancel out ultimately, because the total is still zero, and therefore it doesn't violate the law of conservation of energy in that sense.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Next objection is about mereological nihilism that claims, for example, our universe does not exist even as a whole, but rather as a parts and similar. So can you explain that a little more and how you respond on this critique?
Yeah, so I don't think this view actually refutes the Kalam argument. Why? Because even if we don't think about the universe as a whole, regardless of whether there's this whole or not or no whole, we can still think about change. It is undeniable that changes happen, that events happen, right? Even if these events are not part of the whole, they still happen. Okay, so and this happening, these events are things that has a beginning, right? So when there's change, there is a beginning of the change. And so when events happen, there is a beginning to the happening. And I already explained just now that whatever begins, right, is will have to have a cause. Okay. And there cannot be an infinite regress of causes, right? Because there cannot be an infinite regress of dependence, as I explained just now. And therefore, there must still be a first cause, right? So regardless of whether you think about the universe as a whole or not whole, it doesn't affect the conclusion because there must still be change, and change are things that has beginning. And whatever begins to exist will still depend on the cause, and there cannot be infinite regress of dependence, and therefore there must still be a first cause, and therefore and you can still deduce that and you can go on to deduce that the first cause must still be without beginning, having initially changeless and having libertarian freedom, and therefore is a personal creator. And so all the steps of the cosmological argument still remains, right? So you still get the conclusion that there must still be a first cause that is a personal creator. And therefore God must still exist, right? Regardless of whether you think about the universe as a whole or not, right? So mereological nihilism doesn't deny the cosmological argument.
All right, thank you so much. And now some might argue that the causal principle only applies to the things that begin to exist out of nothing. Which would only be the universe, since other things that begin to exist are simply reorganizations of things. Thus, from this perspective, the Kalam argument seems circular. What is your response?
Well, I don't see why the Kalam argument is circular. Now, the causal principle applies to whatever begin to exist, right? So just now I already explained that using the modus tollens argument, which I briefly talked about just now, that whatever begin to exist will need to depend on something else, making it the case that it is this thing rather than something else that begin to exist, right? Because otherwise we will have other kinds of things that begin to exist uncaused, but that's around us, say for example, but that's not the case, right? So I already explained this just now. So the causal principle doesn't necessarily only apply to something that begin to exist out of nothing, although it does apply to that as well, right? So it says that something does not come from nothing, right? Whatever begin to exist will have to have something else bring it about. And so the causal principle does apply to that, but it also applies to the events around us. It also applies to reorganizations, right? It also applies to reorganization of things, because reorganization is a kind of event, right? So for example, if I organize my table or I organize my laptop, right, that is something that happens, right? And when the reorganization happens, a new organized structure begins to exist, and that structure has a beginning, right? And it is obviously caused by me, right? When I organize the table become a new structure, and there is an efficient cause, right? I am the cause, right? I caused the reorganization. And so organization or reorganization, these are events that happen, and events that happen has a beginning, and whatever begin to exist has a cause, as I showed just now using the modus tollens arguments. And therefore the causal principle will still apply, right, to those kinds of events as well. And so, regardless, and so this objection doesn't rebut the cosmological argument, right? Because in any case, right, the causal principle would still apply. Yeah.
Okay, awesome answer. And now, why should we not say that the cause of the universe is something else rather than God? For example, zero-dimensional point or some singularity or quantum field or any other cause that we don't know even. That is more simple, rather than God, who brings with it too many paradoxes, contradictions, and problems. For example, if we follow the principle of parsimony, we should minimize the commitment, Graham Oppy says that, and maximize the explanation. For example, the only attributes that a zero-dimensional point must possess are timelessness, aseity, transcendence, metaphysical necessity, spatial non-extension, and the state of causing space-time to begin to exist. So how do you respond on this objection?
Well, I think this objection fails to consider the requirement that the first cause must have, right, in order to bring about the first event from an initially changeless state, right? So as I explained just now, the steps of the cosmological argument actually demonstrates that there must be a first cause, which is not only without beginning, but also must be initially changeless as well. And in order for this initially changeless first cause to bring about the first event, it must have the two capacities I mentioned just now, right? So it must be able to bring about the first event by itself, and also be able to hold back, to prevent itself from changing initially, such that it can be initially changeless. And this dual capacity describes what philosophers call libertarian freedom. And therefore, the first cause must be something that has libertarian freedom, which means that it is a personal first cause, rather than just an impersonal zero-dimensional point or whatever, right? Or a quantum field, it cannot be, right? Because a quantum field doesn't have free will, right? A quantum field cannot, a quantum field doesn't have those two capacities I mentioned just now, right? It doesn't have the capacity to prevent itself from changing or be initially changeless. And the quantum field is not like that. The quantum field is constantly fluctuating, right? That's what we mean by quantum field, right? There are spontaneous particles that emerge, right, from the field. And so the quantum field is not initially changeless. And therefore, the quantum field cannot be the first cause, right? Because as I already said, the first cause is something that is initially changeless, right? And so all the other hypotheses doesn't work, right? The singularity is also not something that has libertarian freedom, right? And likewise, those other things you mentioned, they don't have libertarian freedom, right? And so those other things cannot be the first cause, right? The only thing that can be the first cause is something that has libertarian freedom, which means that it is a personal creator, and which means that this creator God must exist. Now, just now you mentioned that God brings the God hypothesis has too many paradox or contradictions. I don't see any. Right? What is the problem? Right? Where's the contradiction? I don't see any. I don't see any paradox or contradiction with the idea of God. And I don't see that there's any problems which cannot be solved. And so I think the God the conclusion that God exists is still the best conclusion, right? Now, Graham Opie, he also said that, well, we should follow the principle of parsimony. But the principle of parsimony only applies if other things being equal, right? If all things being equal, we should favor the simpler hypothesis. But in this case, it is not the case that all things being equal, right? Rather, we have a deductive argument which shows that the first cause must be something that has libertarian freedom, okay? And we know that if an argument is deductively valid, and the premises are true, the conclusion must be true, right? Because deduction preserves the truth of the premise. That's what deductive argument means, right? So if an argument is deductively valid, it will preserve the truth of the premise, and therefore the conclusion must be true as well. And I already explained just now that the cosmological argument, which I presented, is such an argument, right? I already explained just now that the argument is deductively valid. It is deductively valid. And I have also explained just now why the premises are true. And therefore, the conclusion must be true, right? The conclusion is that there must be a creator God, right? This conclusion must be true, okay? And so a deductively valid argument is more powerful than the argument from parsimony, right? The principle of parsimony is, as I said, it only works when all things being equal. But first of all things is not being equal here, right? And moreover, the principle of parsimony is just a kind of explanatory, it's just referred to a kind of a better explanation, which is more likely to be true, right? But it doesn't guarantee the certainty of the result. Whereas a deductive argument guarantees the certainty of the result, right? As I said just now, if an argument is deductively valid, premises are true, the conclusion will be true, right? So the certainty is guaranteed. And so a deductive argument is more powerful, right, than the argument of parsimony. Which in any case doesn't work in this case as well, right? Because it's not the case that all things are being equal. And so for all these reasons, I think this objection totally failed, right? It doesn't refute the cosmological argument at all. So there must still be a first cause, who is a personal creator.
Great answer. And just let me add to this, because many will say that problems are, for example, omniparadoxes about omniscience and omnipotence and other. Also, maybe they will add, if he's a Christian God, logical problem of Trinity, maybe problem of evil and others. So maybe they say, okay, because of those all problems, that's not a simple explanation. How you answer on that?
Yeah. Now, the first thing we need to clarify is that all these other issues, all these other problems, doesn't affect the cosmological argument, right? Why? Because all that the cosmological argument tries to show is that there must be a first cause with libertarian freedom, right? Which means that it's a creator God. The cosmological argument doesn't. So whether this creator God is omniscient, omnipotent, or Trinity or not, that is a separate issue. Okay. Now we can discuss those other issues using other arguments. Okay. So for example, we can look into the historical evidence concerning Jesus and argue that there is historical, because Jesus claimed to be a person within the creator God, and his resurrection substantiate his claim. And therefore, there is good historical evidence to think that Jesus is a person within the creator God. So this will provide us basis for thinking that God is more than one person, that he's a Trinity, and that Jesus is a revelation of God, right? And he told us that God is omniscient, omnipotent. So we can discuss all these arguments so we can discuss all these other attributes, right? The Trinity, omnipotence, omniscience, using other arguments. Those are independent of the cosmological argument and doesn't affect the cosmological argument, right? And so the conclusion of the cosmological argument itself doesn't have all these other problems. It doesn't face all these other problems about omniscience or Trinity or whatever, right? So yeah, so the conclusion still follows, regardless of whether so it doesn't affect the conclusion of the cosmological argument. Now, as to other problems about Trinity, omnipotence, I think those can be solved using other arguments. Okay. So, for example, philosophers have discussed divine omnipotence and showed that. So I have an article on divine omnipotence, right? So I've written on this and argued that actually those paradoxes can be solved using other arguments. Say, for example, the paradox of the stone, right? Some people have asked, can an all-powerful God create a stone he cannot carry, right? And my response is that I can ask the person, right? Can an omnipotent God create a shapeless square? Of course, there cannot be anything like a shapeless square, right? Because if there's a square, then it must have shape, right? So a shapeless square, no, there cannot be any such thing, right? So likewise, I would argue that there cannot be any such stone that God cannot carry, okay? Because it will likewise be a logical contradiction, right? God cannot create logical contradictions because there's no such thing, okay? Just as there's no such thing like a shapeless square, right? Likewise, there's no such thing like a stone that God cannot carry. And this doesn't impinge on his omnipotence because, as I said just now, omnipotence doesn't require God to create something that is logically contradictory because there's no such thing, right? And so a person who asks God to create a stone he cannot carry is actually asking God to do nothing, right? Because there's no such thing, right, to be done, right? Just like there's no such thing like a shapeless square to be created. And so I think those paradoxes can be solved, right? Those paradoxes are based on bad thinking. They are based on contradiction themselves, right? Which cannot possibly exist anyway. And so I don't think those paradox against omnipotence actually holds. And likewise, the Trinity, I think we can talk about that another day, right? There are various models of the Trinity which can show that actually the Trinity doesn't entail contradiction either, okay? So I think those problems can be solved on using other arguments. And in any case, they don't affect the conclusion of the cosmological argument, which shows that in any case, there must still be a creator God, right? Who created the universe. Yeah.
Yes, I agree. Thank you so much. This is really powerful. So let me just add once again, because this is a really important question for many people, I believe, in my at least country. So let's consider resurrection. We will not talk about this topic, but just analogy with Kalam argument, because they will say resurrection is supernatural event. You need miracles and other stuff that doesn't happen very often. So it's not likely explanation. So like that, they will say also for a column argument, because we didn't have such events. And can you explain that?
Well, yes, a miracle is something that doesn't happen often, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be a miracle, right? But the fact that it doesn't happen often doesn't mean that therefore it is therefore a bad conclusion. Why? Because first of all, we need to consider what a miracle is supposed to be, right? A miracle is supposed to be an event that is brought about by God or angels or whatever, right? Some supernatural beings, and they do these events with some reason, with some purpose, right? So if there's a God, right, he wouldn't do miracles all the time without any purpose, right? There would be some reason why he does miracles. So a God. So what I'm trying to say is that if there's a God, he may well choose to do a miracle only on special occasions, right? So if you ask why didn't my grandfather rise from the dead? Why didn't Gautama rise from the dead? Why didn't Muhammad rise from the dead? Why only Jesus rise from the dead, right? I always say that, well, because Jesus was special, right? Because Jesus was a special person, right? He's a revelation of God. That's why God chose to raise Jesus, but not raise other people. And so this will explain why the resurrection is such a rare event, right? It only happened in a very few cases, right? And in the case of Jesus, Jesus also happened to claim to be divine, right? Also happened to claim to be God. And so that makes his resurrection unique, right? In substantiating his unique claim, and give us reason to think that he is God as he claimed. Okay, and so the infrequency of miracle, the fact that miracles is very it doesn't happen regularly, is not a good argument against the plausibility of miracle. Why? Because as I said, right, God may well choose, if there's a God, he may well choose to do miracle only on special occasions. Okay, and now and so we have to look at the historical evidence, right, to find out whether there is good evidence to show that this event really happened or not. And in my books, I've written 3 books on the resurrection, right? So I show that there is good historical evidence, right? There are eyewitness testimony, multiple independent early sources which indicate that there are people in the first century who actually claim to have seen Jesus alive after his crucifixion. And in my books, I explained that these people, they are not lying. They truly saw something, and it's not a hallucination. They saw someone who is bodily alive, and this person is not someone else, but they didn't miss. But it's Jesus himself who died on the cross earlier, but was seen alive again later, and so that means that he resurrected, right? So that proves that he resurrected. Now you can look into I'll encourage you and your audience to look in my book into the details. I don't have time to explain it today. But I just want to say that that you have to look at the evidence, right? The evidence shows that he did resurrect. Okay, so that will be a proof for the resurrection. Now back to the Kalam arguments. Is it a bad hypothesis to appeal to God, to say that God miraculously created the universe? Now again, I don't think that it is a bad hypothesis to say that God did it. Why? Because as I said just now, the conclusion that God created the universe follows from a deductive argument, right? I already explained just now that the cosmological argument is deductively valid and the premises are true. Therefore, the conclusion must be true as well. Okay. So again, right, we cannot and so the conclusion must be true, right? Even regardless of whether it's a frequent event or infrequent event, that doesn't deny the conclusion, because the conclusion follows from deduction, right? And so and again, right, as I said just now, God wouldn't do miracles all the time, right? I mean, we wouldn't expect God to create universe and keep on creating universe, and therefore it's not surprising, right, if this event doesn't happen often, right? But the fact that it doesn't happen often doesn't mean that it doesn't happen at all, right? On the other hand, we have this deductive argument which shows that it must have happened in the past, right? There must be a first cause that caused the first events, as I explained just now, and therefore the conclusion of the Kalam argument still follows. There must still be a creator God.
Thank you, Dr. Loke. And just this, I need further explanation about, you said parsimony principle is applied only on equal stuff. So where you get this idea? Can you argue this?
Yeah, the principle of parsimony only applies when all things being equal. What that means is that if there are 2 explanations, and each explanation explain what needs to be explained equally well, then you would prefer a simpler one, right? Say for example, right, if when there's thunder or lightning that happens, and you can explain those using natural causes, right? There are natural causes that cause that to happen. Then you don't need to think about additional causes, right? You don't need to think about, okay, there may be a thunder god or a lightning god, right, that cause the lightning to happen. That will be postulating something extra, which is unnecessary, right, to explain the event. So you would prefer a simpler hypothesis. You would prefer to say that, okay, it's just a natural cause that caused the event, right? You don't need to think about additional causes when it's not necessary. Okay? So that is the principle that lies behind the principle of parsimony, right? However, when we talk about the cosmological argument, when we talk about the first events, as I said just now, right, it is not the case that the natural causes is already sufficient to explain the first events. On the contrary, I already explained that in order to cause the first events, the first cause must have libertarian freedom, right? And so there must still be a creator God, right? Natural causes are, you cannot say it's just happened naturally. No, there must be, because the deductive argument shows that it didn't happen naturally. There must be, rather, it must be brought about by a first cause, which has libertarian freedom, right? And so in that case, the principle of parsimony doesn't apply, right? Because the natural explanation is not sufficient to explain what needs to be explained, okay? And therefore, there will be a need to postulate, to draw the conclusion that, that there is something else other than natural causes that brings about the universe, arrive at the conclusion that there must be a creator God. Yeah.
Can we say that we simply don't know the cause of the universe? Maybe that's more humble or something like that. Do you agree with this or no?
Well, a lot of people think that it is more humble, right, to say that I don't know. However, now of course, humility is a virtue, right? But humility is not the only virtue. I think the other virtue is also honesty, right? We need to be honest with the argument. We need to be honest with the evidence, okay? And in this case, we do have a good argument, right, to show that we do have a sound argument, in fact, right? An argument with true premises and valid deduction, which means that the conclusion is true. And we have to be honest about this, right? So faced with the fact that there is such an argument which proves that God exists, we have to conclude that, that there is a God, right? That is intellectual honesty. Now, as for humility, the reason why people think that we don't know is because they would say that we humans, there's so much things that we don't know about, right? Of course, we are finite in our knowledge. But then again, the fact that we don't know everything doesn't mean that we don't know anything, right? Obviously, it's true that we don't know everything, but there is still some things that we do know, right? So, for example, I do know that I exist, right? I do know that I came from my parents, and I also know that my parents came from my grandparents, and I also know that there cannot be infinite regress, as I really showed just now, right? There cannot be an infinite regress of train cars without a first puller. I also know that is the case. So and so on and so forth, right? So and therefore, I also, if you based on what we do know, based on what I do know, right? I know that there cannot be infinite regress. There must still be a first cause, and I know that all the steps of the argument is true, as I already explained just now, and therefore I still know that there must be a creator God, right? So and we have to be honest, right, to follow the arguments and evidence, and to accept the conclusion, to follow the evidence wherever it leads. Okay, and this is not contrary to humility, right? Because humility doesn't deny the fact that we do know some things, right? And on the basis of what we know, we can deduce that there must be a creator God.
Yeah, great answer. Thank you so much. And now, criticism of Graham Oppy in your discussion, I notice he says that if God is beginningless, then pick any state of God and he will have a state before it. Because if some state have a beginning, then it's not beginningless. But if God is beginningless, then it is infinite regress. Could you explain this critique a bit and give an answer?
I think this critique is based on a confusion. It's confused. Why? Because if God is beginningless, it doesn't mean that there will be a state of God which will have a previous state. Why? Because there are a few ways to understand beginninglessness, right? Beginninglessness can be understood, for example, as states in which there is no time. Okay. So if we understood that way, then there isn't any infinite regress, right? So So let me explain a bit more, right? So what do I mean by no time, timelessness? Okay. So timelessness, so first of all, we need to understand what is time, right? Now, time can be understood as a series of events that happen, a relational view of time, or it can be understood as a dimension of time, right? Where and and that dimension may exist without any change, right? So that would be a substantival view of time. So these are two different understanding of view of time. But in any case, regardless of which view is true, we can think about a first cause which exists without any dimension of time whatsoever, and also without any change initially, right, whatsoever. So such a first cause will be existing without beginning, right? Because there's no dimension, there's no change, he's just there. There is no big and there's no beginning of his existence, right? In that state where he is in. So such a first cause will be what we mean by transcendence, right? He'll be transcending time, transcending change without any change initially. So such a God will be such a first cause, creator God will be beginningless, and in that case, you'll be fallacious to think that you can pick up any state and there'll be a state before it, right? Because there'll be no before, right? Because he's without that, there'll be no dimension of time, right? So in the absence of dimension of time, there wouldn't be anything before. And in the absence of change initially, right, there will also not be any state before, right? Because to say that there's something before implies that there is a series of states, right? And you can think of it as a series of state will be a kind of a change, right? From changing from one state to another state. But as I said just now, the first cause is initially changeless, right? And so there wouldn't be a series of states, right? And so you'll be forced to think that if you pick up a state, there'll be a state before it, right? That you'll be based, you'll be that will be false, right? So I think this objection is based on a confusion, right? It fails to understand what I have demonstrated so far using the cosmological argument when I show that the first cause is initially changeless, right, and beginningless, right? So it doesn't suffer from any of the problem that Grant Opie mentioned.
All right. Thanks. And if we bring duration to changelessness, then if it is infinite duration of changeless, then it is infinite regress again. If it is a finite duration of changeless, then it has a beginning. So does the introduction of concept of duration undermine the Kalam argument?
Well, I don't see any good reason to bring in the concept of duration, right? Why think that there must be duration at the beginning? Why think that there must be a dimension of time? No, sorry. Why think that there must be duration to the beginningless state, right? Why think so? Okay. As I said just now, we can think about the first cause existing without any duration, without any dimension of time, and without any beginning, right? There's nothing logically contradictory about such a concept. So there's no need to bring, there's no independent reason, right, to bring in the concept of duration to the initial state, to the original state of the first cause, right? And so this objection fails, right? Because there's no independent reason to bring in that. That's the first thing I want to say. Now, the second thing I want to say is that even if you bring in the concept of duration, right? Even if you introduce the concept of duration to the original state, still, it doesn't mean that there must be an infinite regress. Why? Because even if there is a dimension of, there is a dimension there, it doesn't mean that this dimension have to be divided into parts such that there's an infinite regress of parts or infinite regress of events. On the contrary, as I already argued just now, using the cosmological argument, the first cause must be initially changeless. I already explained just now, right? And so what that means is that there is no infinite regress of change. Okay, so that there could still be a dimension existing there, but this dimension is not changing, right? There's no change within the dimension, and so it'll be without, and so it doesn't suffer from the problem of infinite regress. What in that case, what you will have is a dimension that is infinitely long, right? But it doesn't have any measures. It doesn't have any change existing within it. And such an infinitely long dimension doesn't suffer from the problem of dependence regress, right? Because a dependence regress only, the problem of dependence regress only exists when there is something that begins to exist that depends on something else beginning to exist before it. But in this case, there is only an infinitely long dimension without any change, right? Without anything that begins to exist and depend on something else before it, right? So there is no problem with dependence regress in this case, okay? If there's no change. And it also doesn't suffer from the problem of traversing an actual infinite, right? Because it's just an infinitely long duration without anything traversing at all, right? Because there's no change. So there's no successive addition that's happening, right? In this infinitely long state. And so this infinitely long state, even if that is the case, it also doesn't contradict the conclusion of the Kalam argument. It doesn't also suffer from any of the problems I mentioned just now, right? The problems I mentioned just now will only happen if there is an infinite regress of changes, okay? But an infinite duration, the way I describe it, right, could just refer to an infinitely long dimension without any change happening in that dimension, right? I think that is logically possible. So if that is the case, it also doesn't contradict the cosmological argument, right? And in any case, there's no good reason to think that we must have an infinitely long dimension in any case, right? And so if the critic wants to use this as an objection against the cosmological argument, he has to first prove that there must be an infinite duration, right? But I don't see any proof to think that is the case, and therefore, in any case, I don't think that this is a good objection in any case.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Is this correct statement? You cannot infer something from something that always exists to unnecessary existing. What do you say?
You cannot infer from something that always exists to a necessary being. So this is talking about something else already, I think. Yeah, because the cosmological argument which I presented is not inferring from something that always exists, right? Rather, the cosmological argument I have presented just now is inferring from something that doesn't always exist, right? So for example, I didn't always exist. Right? I have a beginning. I came from my parents, and my parents do not always exist, and they are caused by something else, right? And from that, we can conclude that there must be a first cause, as I already explained just now. So this statement doesn't affect the cosmological argument I presented in any case. But on the other hand, I don't think that this statement is also true, because there are other kinds of cosmological argument which says that even if the universe always exists, there must still be a necessary being that sustains the universe in existence, or explain the contingent events in the universe, right? So those will be other versions of the cosmological argument, right? Those will be the Leibnizian version and Thomistic version, and they have other independent reasons for their arguments, and so which and I think those other independent arguments may well be sound as well, right? But we don't have time to discuss it today. And so in any case, I don't think that this statement is a correct statement, because I think that there could be other reasons that can be given, right, about against this statement. But in any case, this statement doesn't rebut the cosmological argument, the Kalam version, which I presented today.
Thank you, Dr. Loke. And why couldn't we say that the universe simply exists without explanation as a brute fact? That's common objection, so sorry.
Yeah, so I already explained just now that the brute fact, which here is referring to the first cause, right? I already explained just now that the first cause can be deduced to be something that is uncaused, without beginning, initially changeless, and also has libertarian freedom, right? But the universe, the physical universe, is not something that is changed, that is initially changeless, right? Rather, as I said just now, according to physics, the quantum field is constantly fluctuating, right? And so the physical universe is not something that is ever changeless at all, right? And moreover, the physical universe is not something that has libertarian freedom, right? It's not something that has free will to bring about something else. And therefore, for these reasons, the universe itself cannot be the first cause. The first cause must be something else. It must be something that is initially changeless, which means that it must be something that transcends the physical universe, which is constantly changing. And also, the first cause, as I said just now, as I already explained just now, right, it must be something that has libertarian freedom, which means that it is a personal creator of the universe rather than the universe itself, right? So the creator, the first cause creator God, must be something that is distinct from the universe. Okay. And so what this implies is that the cosmological argument not only refutes atheism, but it also refutes pantheism as well, right? So pantheism is the idea that God is everything, everything is God. That is false. Why? Because the cosmological argument shows that there must be a first cause that is distinct from the universe, right? That transcends the universe. And so the cosmological argument would also refute pantheism as well.
All right. You said that the first cause is uncaused, and that's reasonable. But one philosopher said that perhaps the universe has a cause, but that cause has another cause. For instance, it could be that God created an angel and gave it the power to create the universe. So maybe there are more first causes. How do you respond on this critique?
No, the first cause cannot have other causes, right? Because if the first cause has another cause, then the first cause wouldn't be the first, right? So you cannot have something else that caused the first cause, right? Because as I said, there cannot be infinite regress, right? So the regress must terminate, must stop with a first cause that is uncaused, right? The first cause cannot be caused by something else. Now, could that be more than one first causes, right? So could that be that in addition to a creator, that there is also something else that together they bring about the first event? Now, that will be another issue. And now, to consider that issue, so could it be that there is an angel, right, which is created by God? So God is the first cause. God create the angel. The angel will be the second cause, right? And then the angel bring about the universe. Now, or could there be something else in addition to God, right? So could there be more than one God, right? Could there be more than one first cause? Now, concerning all these hypotheses, I think we can use the principle of parsimony, which atheists like to use, right? Which Graham O.P. like to use. We can use the principle of parsimony to exclude these other hypotheses, right? So what we can say is that, well, there's no independent reason to think that there is more than one first cause, or to think that God has created an angel. I mean, there's no independent reason to think that God has created an angel to create the universe, right? There's no good independent reason for that. And therefore, using the principle of parsimony, I think we should exclude all these other hypotheses, right? Because they are unnecessarily complicated, right? So the simplest hypothesis is that there is one first cause which brings about the universe, and yeah, so following the cosmological argument, right, we can deduce that there must be at least one such first cause. And using the principle of parsimony, we can say that there's no good reason to think that there's more than one, and therefore we should stay with the conclusion that there is one first cause.
Good response, yeah. So would you say that the first cause must be also immaterial, unimaginably powerful, and spaceless, like Dr. Craig say? And would you agree or not?
Now, I think we can arrive at this conclusion using other arguments, right? Together with the cosmological argument, right? So the cosmological argument is not the only argument for Christian theism. As I said just now, there's also other arguments like the resurrection argument, which is evidence that Jesus is God, and Jesus can tell us a bit more about this first cause, right? He can tell us that this first cause is a Trinity. He can tell us that this first cause is transcends space, etc. So I do think that, I do agree based on all these different arguments that the first cause is indeed immaterial, unimmeasurably powerful, and spaceless. Now, however, if you just talk about the cosmological, if you just consider the cosmological argument by itself, now I think that the cosmological argument by itself can show that the first cause is immaterial. Why? Because, as I already explained just now, based on our understanding of physics, right? Physics help us understand what is material, right? What is physical things. And physics indicate that material things are constantly changing, okay? And this is also based on our inductive experience as well. When we look at material things around us, we find that they are also constantly changing, right? So, so on the basis of this evidence, we have good reason to think that material things are constantly changing, right? But however, I already showed just now that the first cause is initially changeless, which means that it is not material, right? It is immaterial. And we can also conclude that the first cause is unimaginably powerful, right? In order to bring about the events that led to the formation of that led to other events that eventually bring about, right? The galaxies, the solar systems, and the wonderful systems that we observe and we can study using science, right? So the first cause is very powerful indeed. Now, can the cosmological argument shows that the first cause is spaceless? Now, at this point in time, I am not yet convinced by Dr. Craig's argument on this point, because now Dr. Craig argues from Big Bang cosmology, right? Because he says that space, according to the standard model of the Big Bang, space and time began at the Big Bang. But then again, there are alternative models of the Big Bang, right? So some cosmologists have speculated that perhaps before the Big Bang, there is some other physical states that occur, and so those other physical states will exist in space as well. And so it's not necessarily the case that space just began at the Big Bang, right? Now, my response is that even if there are other physical states before the Big Bang, right, those other physical states will still need to have a first cause, right? As I already explained just now, right? There cannot be infinite regress of physical states, right? Because physical states are in constant change, as I already explained. So there cannot be infinite regress of change. There must still be a first cause that has libertarian freedom that bring about the first event. But will this first cause necessarily be changeless based on the cosmological argument? I think the cosmological argument by itself doesn't prove that the first cause must be spaceless, right? But I do think that it is enough to prove that the first cause is a personal creator, has libertarian freedom, as I already explained, and also immaterial and also unimaginably powerful. Yeah.
Thank you. What about time? Because if let's say that the Big Bang cosmology is correct model, and yeah, it's brought space and time, and yeah, it is I would say okay to say that cause is timeless or something like that. What is your response?
Yeah. So as I said just now, there are cosmologists who have suggested alternative models, according to which the Big Bang may not be the very beginning of time and space. Okay, so that there may be some other physical states that exist before the Big Bang, and those may have other spatial or temporal dimensions to them. Okay, yeah. So this is a possibility that scientists are still exploring. Yeah, but as I said just now, this does not rebut the conclusion of the cosmological arguments. Ultimately, there must still be a first cause or creator. But then again, we cannot therefore create think that the first cause itself must be necessarily spaceless just based on the cosmological argument alone.
Yeah, but can we just imagine, for example, that Big Bang cosmology is correct one, and in
Yeah.
that situation, in that hypothesis, would you say that in that specific situation, we have a spaceless and timeless cause, or not, even in that scenario?
So if we assume that the standard cosmology is correct, and even then, what we can conclude is that our space-time dimension began at the Big Bang. But then again, it doesn't exclude the possibility that the first cause may be in another spatial dimension, right? In another spatial dimension that is not that is beyond the space-time dimension which began at the Big Bang. And so again, I don't see how the conclusion of spacelessness follows. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Is the first cause unchanging? Because if it created the universe, then that is an action or change, and therefore it is impossible to for the first cause to be changeless. Do you agree with this?
Now, we have to distinguish between changelessness and essential changelessness, right? So as I said just now, we can deduce that the first cause is initially changeless, which means that its original state is without change. But it doesn't mean that it is essentially changeless. It doesn't mean that it cannot change, right? All the cosmological argument shows is that the first cause is without change initially, but being without change initially doesn't mean that it cannot change, right? So it's just like you can imagine a person sitting without moving, right? And so he'll be motionless, right? But the fact that he is without motion initially doesn't mean that he cannot move, right? I mean, so if I sit down, I don't move. I'm not without any. I exist without motion in that state. But I can still choose to raise my hand, right? If I want, right? I can still choose to move. Okay. So likewise, the first cause is initially unchanging, which means that it exists in the original state without beginning, without any change. But it doesn't mean that it cannot freely choose to change and to bring about a universe, right? In fact, as I said just now, it must be able to do that, right, in order to bring about the first event. Otherwise, the first cause cannot be the first cause of the first effect, right, of the first event. So what this shows is, in fact, that the first cause must have libertarian freedom, right? It must be able to freely, right, choose to do that. Just as I sit down, I can freely choose to move, right? Initially I don't move, but I can freely choose to move. Likewise, the first cause is initially without change, but it can freely choose to change, right? It can freely choose to bring about an action, a change, bring about the first event. And therefore, it is not impossible that the first cause is initially changeless, but it can freely choose to change, right? And it did freely choose to change. So it is only initially without change originally, but that doesn't mean that it cannot freely bring about the first event and therefore bring about the first change.
Okay, nice. This is the last question. Sorry for many questions. And this is a long one, so let me read. This is a critique from my friend. And he says, the idea that everything is caused, that there are no brute contingent facts, or facts which aren't explained by the antecedent conditions free will, which Christians hold. Because the free will defender wants to say that his will is uncaused. So, as an internal critic, we found something that begins to exist, but is uncaused, the will. If the will is caused, then there is no free will. Semantic analysis would say we understand free will as the idea that there is no prior cause to the will. If the will is caused, then determinism is true. As a simple question, how does your argument, which doesn't accept brute contingency, accounts for a free will, which relies on there being a brute contingency?
No, I think there are a number of mistakes in the question, right? There's a lot of confusion. Now, first of all, the cosmological argument is not saying that everything is caused, right? But rather the cosmological argument is saying that everything that begins to exist has a cause, okay? So if something has no beginning, then it's not caused, right? So the idea is not that everything is caused, right? But everything that begins to exist has a cause. Now, the second thing to note is that free will, libertarian freedom, also doesn't mean that the free choice is uncaused, right? It doesn't mean that. Rather, what libertarian freedom is trying to say is that the free choice is caused by the person, right? The person causes the choice, right? Because if there's no person, then there will be no free will, right? So free will presupposes that there must already be something that already exists. The person making the choice, right? That person must already exist. And that person is the cause of his choice, right? So there is a cause there, right? It's not uncaused, right? Free choice, free will is not uncaused events. They are caused events. However, these events, they are caused, but they are not deterministic, okay? So causation doesn't imply determinism, right? I think your friend is confusing these two ideas. Now, what determinism means is that every event happened in such a way that it couldn't be otherwise, right? But it doesn't mean, but then on libertarian freedom, it is true that the free choice could be otherwise, right? But it doesn't mean that it's uncaused, okay? So for example, I freely choose, say for example, if I freely choose to raise my hand, I'm the cause of my raising of hands, right? I choose to do that. My free choice, I bring about the raising of my hand, but I could have chosen otherwise, right? I could have chosen not to raise my hand, right? And so in that case, determinism doesn't hold, right? But it doesn't mean that it's uncaused. Right? There's still a cause, right? I'm the one who caused the raising of my hand. So the raising of my hand, this event could have been otherwise, right? But there is still a cause, right? I'm the one who caused the raising of my hand. And so my arguments so the question that your friend asked, right? How does your argument, which doesn't accept brute contingency? Well, now again, we need to distinguish what we mean by contingency, right? So by contingency, contingent events refer to those events that could be otherwise, right? And as I said just now, a free choice could be otherwise, but it is not brute, okay? Why? Because there is a cause, right? As I said just now, the free agent is the cause of the choice, and so a free will doesn't rely on there being brute contingency in that sense, right? Because those contingency are in fact not brute, right? They are caused by the person. So I don't think your friend's objection holds. Right? I hope that clarifies.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Loke. And I just wonder at the end, what other arguments for God's existence in your cumulative case would you use beside Kalam argument? I know you use fine-tuning, you mentioned resurrection. So what are other arguments that you would use?
So I have used a number of arguments, the cosmological arguments, and also the fine-tuning arguments, also the argument from the laws of nature, which I argue in my book, The Teleological and Kalam Cosmological Arguments Revisited. This book is published by Springer Nature. It's one of the leading academic publishers. In this book, I argue that the laws of nature will have to have a lawgiver, right? That the laws of nature couldn't have just existed without any lawgiver, without an intelligent creator creating and determining the laws to exist, right? So the highly ordered systems of our universe would require someone, an intelligent being, to make these mindless physical entities constantly operate in a highly ordered, rational, systematic way, which can be described by the laws of nature. Okay, So this will be another argument, right, to show that, that there is a designer of the universe, a creator of the universe. So this will be three arguments. And there is another argument which I have also defended, which is the moral argument. So I've written a paper on this. So I have argued that there are laws of morality. And again, these laws would have to have a lawgiver as well, right? So yeah, so a moral lawgiver, right? So I've defended this argument too. And just now I mentioned that there's the resurrection argument and also the argument for Jesus being God, right? So, and I think all these arguments come together very nicely. Why? Because after we have presented the cosmological argument and the teleological argument and the moral arguments, what that shows is that there must be somebody up there, right? A creator, a personal creator who is the ground of objective morality. And it's very easy for us human beings to recognize that we have not lived up to the moral standards that we know we should live up to, right? So even though there's a lot of things we know it's right to do, but very often we don't do it, okay? And there are some things which we know we shouldn't do, but we still do it, right? So it's very easy for us to realize that we are not perfect, right? We have fallen short of the perfect standard. And so we have fallen short, right, of the absolute standard, which is grounded in God himself, right? We have the person up there, right? We have not lived up to his standard, right? Because he is the one who is the ground of the moral laws, right? And also the laws of nature, right? So we have not lived up to the perfect standard. And therefore, we have fallen short, right, of his requirements. And so we need redemption, we need salvation. Now, which religion offers redemption and salvation? Okay. All other religions say that you have to try to work hard, you have to try to do good works. But the problem is that even though, of course, we should do good works, but the problem is that we all fail to do it perfectly, right? We all fall short. And so there's no hope in other religions. The only religion that teach that we are saved by grace is Christianity, right? Christianity shows us that God knows that we have fallen short, and he sent Jesus into the world, right, to redeem us. He come down to save us, to bring us up to him. Okay. And so it's only in Christianity that we find this unique message that we are not saved based on our good works, but saved by his grace and based on what he has done for us. And so this will be another argument, right, for Christian theism, which I presented, the uniqueness of the Christian message of salvation, which is found only in Christianity, but in no other religions, right? So this is another additional evidence to show that Christianity is revealed by God, right? God came down to show us this way of salvation. And so this argument, together with other arguments, right? Say, for example, the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection, right? This argument shows us that Christianity, Jesus is not a myth, right? But he's a real person who actually lived and died and resurrected. And so this will be additional arguments to show that Christianity is true. Okay, so when we take all these arguments together, I mentioned about quite a number of them already, right? About 5 or 6 of them, right? We take all these together, we will come to realize that Christianity is true, and that's why we should believe in Christianity, right? Because it is true, and it's also our only hope, right? The only way that can redeem us, that can save us, right, from the problems that we are facing in the world right now. Yeah, it's the only thing that can save us from our sins and redeem us and bring us and save us, right, from the state of imperfection that we are in, and bring us into an eternal relationship with God, in whom we can find the real satisfaction, the real joy, eternal happiness, a truly meaningful life, a truly abundant life, right? So that is what God will give us, right? That's why we should believe in Christianity.
Well, thank you so much. This is wonderful message at the end. And do you have any message to audience beside this about conclusion of this discussion about Kalam? Do you have anything to say to our audience? So that's last.
Yeah, that's right. So over the last 1.5 hours, we have covered a lot of topics, right? Because you asked me a lot of questions, right? Now, on all these questions, I can only give a very brief answer because we are short time. But actually, there's a lot more to be said on all these points, right? So, for example, just now we briefly talked about the law of thermodynamics, and I mentioned the zero energy theory, and also talk about causation, also talk about model tolerance arguments. I didn't have time to explain all this in details. So what I'll encourage you and your audience to do is to take a look at my books, right? So I have a number of books which explain all this in greater detail. And I mentioned one of the books just now, the teleological and Kalam cosmological arguments revisited. Now that book is open access, which means that your audience can download it for free, right? You can read it for free, download it for free. So I hope that you can put a link in the description of this video so that the audience can download it. And I have also written a book on the resurrection as well, talking about the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection, and also formulate an argument, a deductive argument to prove that Jesus resurrected. And that book is titled Investigating the Resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that book is also open access. So yeah, you can also put it in the link so that yeah, people can access it, download it, and read for themselves. Yeah. So yeah, I will encourage your audience to look into these publications to find out more details about why I said what I said just now, right? Which you will give the explanations to answer other questions which they may have. Yeah. So I hope these materials will be helpful for you and your audience. Yeah.
All right, that wraps up today's episode. I will put in the description all these links and YouTube channel of Dr. Andrew Loke. And please subscribe to his channel and follow his work and read his books. Dr. Loke, thank you for joining us today, for sharing your experience on this tough topic. And thank you all for tuning in. If you enjoyed this conversation, please like the video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more engaging discussions. Until next time, take care.
Take care.